Hello, everyone. Welcome to History 2023, United States History since 1865. This is lecture one for your course that goes with chapter 16 from our textbook, The Era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. I know that numbering might be a little bit confusing. Hopefully, it all makes sense. So this lecture we're going to get into today, I want to make a note that this lecture and all of the lectures that go on this semester are not meant to replace your textbook readings. All of your assignments, your quizzes, all of those things will come directly from the textbook reading. This is meant to give you kind of an overview and a highlight of things that you're going to be reading that you can either watch before or after reading the textbook, as long as you're reading the textbook. Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into what we're going to be talking about today. We have three topics: presidential Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, and the end of Reconstruction. It's a wild time. And that's why it's important for you to read the textbook, because since this is an online class, I can't give as long of a lecture as I would like to for these topics. And so there's going to be a pretty high level, pretty quick discussion to get just the important bits of information to you. But make sure that you're really delving into it, because there's a lot that happens that we're only going to touch the surface of here. So let's get started with presidential Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is the time period immediately following the Civil War. Once the war ends, now what? Right? The South has surrendered to the North. They've said, okay, we give up, we're coming back. But how do you bring these people into the Union, back into the Union, right? These are people who were in the Union who chose to leave, to commit treason to an extent. And how do you bring them back? How do you reconcile? What changes need to be made at the national, at the southern, at the northern level in order to bring that bond back, to bring that United States back together to being united, right? And so Reconstruction is this time period that we call and label when people don't know what to do. Um, Lincoln has a plan. Lincoln is president at this time. When he, of course, is assassinated, his vice president Andrew Johnson takes over. Johnson has a plan, and then outside of all of that, Congress has a plan. And on top of that, the South has ulterior motives for how they want to be brought back into the Union. So it's a long time period of not really knowing what to do, not really making a lot of headway, lots of going back and forth, lots of disagreements, lots of not talking to each other. It's a mess, right? So the first real attempt that we get to try to bring people back together is presidential Reconstruction, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But one of the big things that comes out of this Reconstruction era that the Union, that the federal Congress passes before Southern states are allowed back into the Union are these three Reconstruction amendments. These are national amendments to the United States Constitution. And they are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they're labeled the Reconstruction Amendments because of the time period that they were passed in, but also because of what the content, what they're actually trying to do. It's all concerned with ending slavery and civil rights, right? So this is our kind of our first, you could say, movement towards civil rights for former slaves, for African Americans at this time. So what are they? They're the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment officially ends slavery and prohibits it in the future, except, and I don't have the full text here, but the full text is in your textbook. The 13th Amendment says that, excuse me, slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime, right? And so we'll see as we continue on through this semester how that comes up and continues to come up, especially in the southern states. And a big offender is Louisiana. That little caveat, little loophole, right? Also kind of makes you wonder what the northern mentality was at that time, because they are the ones who passed this without any real input from the South. So 13th Amendment ends slavery as a practice, except for as punishment for a crime. Now, the slave markets had already been gotten rid of way back when, prior to the Civil War. So it doesn't really do anything with it, doesn't change that because it's already not there, but it, you know, frees all of the slaves and says that slavery cannot exist again in the future. You can't bring it back. The 14th Amendment is going to be passed a little while after that, and it declares that former slaves are equal citizens and that they are afforded equal protection. So this is at equal rights to former slaves because a lot of the sentiment after it was, okay, well, you freed the slaves, that's fine. I don't have to do anything for them. They're still black. I'm still white. They don't have to, or I don't have to give them the same rights, treatments, privileges that I, as a white person, would enjoy. They don't have to follow the same laws that I follow, and I don't have to follow the same laws that they follow, meaning that they follow stricter laws than I do, right? That was still around, even though you got rid of the slave or got rid of slavery, right? Like it doesn't fix that problem just saying, oh, hey, slaves are free, right? So that's why we have to have the 14th Amendment come here and declare that slaves are, in fact, or former slaves are, in fact, a full United States citizens, and that they are afforded that equal protection, equal rights under the Constitution that any citizen would be guaranteed and have a part of. This is kind of a very delayed response to Dred Scott, which is a Supreme Court decision prior to the Civil War, that in that decision, the Supreme Court justices say that slaves and children of slave descendants of slaves, right, and anyone who has ever been a slave is not and can never be a United States citizen. So this amendment is also overturning that prior decision, right? Which is where that kind of sentiment, even though it existed before, this is where that's where it kind of gets codified into law prior to the 14th Amendment. So a very important amendment there. And then finally, the 15th Amendment is it's towards the end of Reconstruction. It's the last one to be passed, obviously. It's 15. But it guarantees voting rights for former slaves, for the freedmen. And it specifically says here, this is part of the original text, that is um, guarantees voting rights for citizens regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It still is only limited to men. Women won't get the right to vote until far later, and we'll cover that as part of this because that's within our scope of our class. But at this point, uh, white men, white landowning men, white non-landowning men, and black men are now able to vote legally under the United States Constitution. So that's all going on in the background. As we're figuring out how do we bring these states back into the Union, President Lincoln has a plan, and it's very lenient towards the Southern states. And it's criticized as being very lenient towards the Southern states when he proposes it back at this time. Um, Lincoln, you know, we have he has a very idealized memory of idealized image in United States consciousness, right? But originally, Lincoln doesn't go to war with the Southern states for slavery, over slavery, right? Obviously, that's why the Southern states leave, but Lincoln goes to war to restore the Union. And that's his primary concern for the entirety of the war, even when he does his Emancipation Proclamation and those gestures and does change the morality of the war to focus on the slaves. He does it with ulterior motives, namely that he doesn't want Europe joining the South. And so he spins it. He says, hey, it's not just like we're trying to get these people back. It's actually because of the slavery, right? And so you can see that reflected here in his plan. That's why he's so lenient to these southern states. He has launched this war to get them back. And now he has them back. He just wants them back. He wants that union back, right? He's the president that the union fell apart under. He wants to be the president it comes back together under as well. So he declares, as part of his plan, that he will declare this proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction December 8th, 1863. That is 2 years before the end of the war. And he basically says, hey, if you stop fighting, it's all good. Well, pretend like it never happened, right? Um, he is going to replace majority rule with loyal rule in the South. So what that means is replacing right in the year or so after the war, replacing democratically elected leaders with people who are loyal to the union and loyal to the constitution and ultimately loyal to him. He's not going to talk to Congress about this. He's going to say that it's within his purview as the president to decide who can become back into the union, who can become a state, and how that will all play out. And he's going to issue this pardon to all Southern citizens except for high ranking military and civilian Confederate officers. So, any of the members of the Confederate Congress, any of the Confederate generals, he's not going to give them a blanket pardon, but just your regular everyday farmer or your low level soldier, he's going to pardon those people and act like they never did anything, right? And then he's going to establish this 10% rule. This 10% rule is going to say that when 10% of your eligible voting population from the 1860 election, right? So not taking into account any new voters going off of the 1860 election when he was elected, that number of voters, 10% of them, when they have taken an oath of loyalty to the United States and to the Constitution, after they take that loyalty, then they can establish a government, a new constitution, a new government, and then it would be recognized and brought back into the Union. So he does put some roadblocks there, but it's not a very satisfying punishment, let's say. And that is why many people in the North do not like it and criticize it as very lenient towards the South. Louisiana actually would be the first state to rejoin the Union under this plan. And part of that is because Louisiana is captured by the Union almost immediately as soon as the Civil War starts. And so, for the majority of the war, Louisiana and specifically New Orleans are Union controlled for the majority of the war. And so, what that means is that those people in Louisiana and in New Orleans can meet that 10% goal a lot quicker than a lot of the other states in the Union can. So Louisiana is also, it's funny because we are the last out from the Union when we initially secede. We're the first back in under presidential reconstruction. And spoiler alert, we're one of the last ones back in when we're kicked out again. So this is Lincoln's plan. He announces it. Some states start working towards this. Louisiana is the first one. Louisiana is actually fully brought back into the Union under this. We have our established government. We have our loyalty oaths, and we're brought back into the Union under this plan. And then Lincoln dies or is killed. Lincoln is assassinated. And then we get Johnson, Andrew Johnson. His vice president becomes president once Lincoln is assassinated. Johnson is a Southerner. He did remain loyal. He did remain in with Lincoln during the entirety of the Civil War, but at heart, he's a former slave owner and he's a Southerner. And so when he becomes president, he takes it even further to make it even more lenient and easier for the Southern states to come back into the Union. And so you can see here this Venn diagram. On Lincoln's plan, he's going to deny pardons to officers and anyone who had killed, right? So any high ranking officials, like we said. And he's going to say, okay, you need to make a new state constitution with 10% of the voters take an oath of allegiance to the United States Constitution. Johnson's going to get rid of that 10%. So he's going to say, yeah, you needed a constitution, but you can, anybody, whoever you want can write it. Doesn't matter. You don't need the 10%. He's going to say you do have to avoid the secession. So you have to say that you were wrong for seceding. You do have to abolish slavery. So you do have to adopt that 13th Amendment into your state constitution. And you have to kind of get rid of the Confederate debt and just decide nobody's getting paid back for that. He also is going to deny pardons to on paper, he's going to keep up Lincoln's denial to pardon high-ranking military and civilian leaders, but quietly he's going to do it anytime he's asked for it. So essentially, what that means is all of the Confederates get pardoned, basically. And because we get rid of this 10% rule, that also means that the people writing these constitutions now are also those former Confederate people who were pardoned by Johnson. So under Lincoln's plan, where we sort of maybe had kind of a better feeling about the people writing the new Constitution, under Johnson's plan, there's no guarantee. And in practice, it works out exactly as you would think. The people who were in power under the Confederacy want to get power again. And so there's not much change that happens at the state and local level once Johnson's plan gets put into effect. Johnson, with this plan, he also will not contact or consult the Congress, and this will just piss them off, right? They were already upset with Lincoln. Now they're even more upset with Johnson. Johnson will ultimately be our first president that's ever impeached successfully by the House. He won't be removed by the Senate, but he is impeached for the first time because of this, and also because of other actions that he takes, which are detailed more in your textbook as well. So once we get through that, we get and turn into a new part of Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, which is completely controlled by the Northern Congress, who don't feel that the South is being punished enough. Now, we can debate and talk about the actual points of that. On the one hand, the Northern, they're right, right. Lincoln and Johnson were very, very easy on the southern states, especially the southern politicians and the southern leaders who initially broke those states away from the Union. However, on a reality level, the everyday citizen in the South suffered far greater than any northern citizen did during the Civil War. And the devastation, the physical and devastation to cities, to businesses, to homes, to farmland, to agriculture, to the economy is far, far worse than anything experienced in the North. So when we have this sentiment from the Northern Congress people about wanting to punish the South, they're really wanting to punish the politicians, but instead they're punishing the people who had suffered the most through the war. So it's a really tricky issue, right? Obviously, this should have been a little bit stricter than the president's, but Congress kind of goes all the way 180 degrees to the complete other opposite end of the spectrum. They are going to have a lot of good things. They will establish the Freedmen's Bureau and really start to invest in the freed slaves and give them homes and places to live and education, and start working that way. It won't last for long because they'll get tired of funding it and working on it, but they start it. They try to get it going. They will pass those 3 Reconstruction amendments and guarantee those voting rights for African American males, but they start a military occupation of the South. Now, in some cases, it's needed after Johnson because you have Confederate people who get back into power and just keep on acting like they never lost the war, right? Keep intimidating. They don't uphold that equal protection. They don't try to change any of their ways. So the Union military is sent down to occupy each of the states until they meet the requirements of the new Constitution and the loyalty oaths and all of those things. And what ends up happening is a lot of resentment built up in the South towards that Union Army, and towards these Union politicians that are sent down to kind of take over the Southern states, rightly or wrongly, right? And so it's tough because you see here there's a lack of communication between northern decision makers in Congress, and then a discrepancy with what's actually happening on the ground in each of the states. So it's detailed a lot more in your textbook. It's a very tricky landscape that we're dealing with. And ultimately, what happens is majority of the southern states will meet their requirements to re-enter the Union and end their military occupation. Louisiana will be one of the last ones to do it, and we only joined the Union at the end of Reconstruction because of the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 happens in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as the president. Rutherford B. Hayes is a Republican running for president, and he doesn't have enough votes. He's just outside of the margin he needs to win and beat the Democratic candidate. So there's a whole bunch of recalls, revotes, all those things like that, recounts. And what ends up happening is Southern Congress people from the states that had been readmitted back to the Union and who are across the board Democrats talk to the Northern congressmen who are across the board Republicans. And they come up with the idea, this compromise, that the Democrats will rescind their nomination for the president on the condition that Rutherford will name a Southerner to a cabinet position, that the federal government will start spending on rebuilding the South, and that they will end military occupation of the South and therefore end Reconstruction. The Northern Congress people and the Republicans agree to this. They agree to all of those demands just to have Rutherford be named president, right? That's what the length that they're going to get their person elected to be president. And also because they're tired of it at this point. It had been over 10 years of this reconstruction, of this fight, of this rebuilding. And the North is just tired of hearing all of the Southern people's problems. And so they're just tired. They're like, whatever, we tried. They didn't really reconstruct, rebuild, or ensure anything for whites or blacks in the South, but they're tired of dealing with it. And so they agree to this compromise, and because of that, that ends Reconstruction. And that's how Louisiana re-enters the Union the second time, is only because of this compromise. And so what we're left with at the end of this Reconstruction period is a South that has not fundamentally changed from secession. The only thing that has changed is the understanding that they can't win, that they don't have the military resources or the coordination or the industry to be able to support a large-scale military movement or even a small-scale military movement against the Union or the Union Army or the northern states. We also have this resurgence, right, that because Confederate people are able to take over those positions in state governments, fundamentally life doesn't change for the freed slaves. They're still facing the same discrimination, the same kind of violence, the same expectations from whites towards blacks, and there's no change fundamentally in that system. And the federal government is not trying to guarantee that that change is happening. And then outside of that, we're left with a rise of white supremacy groups. The KKK gets started during this time. A whole bunch of other Southern white supremacist groups get started throughout the South to oppose this Union interference in Southern politics and Southern life and Southern way of living. We have a greater and greater divide between poor whites and freedmen who have more in common with each other than the poor whites do with the rich whites, but that gets muddied and confused and propagandized into being separated. And so we are, in this time period that we're ending, that is the end of the Civil War, bringing us back to the Union, back to one big happy country. We're left in a state that is not much different than 1860 when the Civil War started. And that we're left in a situation where the status and the life of freedmen are fundamentally not changed from their life as slaves, especially with the introduction of things like sharecropping, right? So what this poses is a challenge immediately. These things that were supposed to change the culture and the way of life don't, right? It also shows the government that's supposed to guarantee these rights for these people doesn't. That they kind of just give in and are tired. It also shows that they are the Union, the North, is not concerned with the actual difficulties of the regular people, of the regular citizens of the South. They're just concerned with the politicians and the people of power there. And so that'll be a theme throughout our whole term here, is analyzing systems of power. And it's a theme in all of my classes, even in American History 1. We want to look at this system of power, who's in power and why, and how do they exert it. Obviously, that's many different degrees to that. But in this case, it's definitely a exertion of Northern power over the South, but then also high-ranking, wealthy Southerners are able to take that system that they're operating in and use it towards their own advantage. So that'll be it for lecture 1 here for chapter 16. Make sure to go ahead and read chapter 16 because it goes into a lot more detail than I did, and you'll have a much fuller understanding and picture of everything that's going on. If you have any questions about anything in this slide or anything that you start reading during the textbook, send me an email or post it in our questions forum. That's a dedicated space for any questions regarding to this course. But that's it. Unless you have any questions, let me know. But that's it for me, and I'll see you guys back here for lecture 2.